Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, everyone. My name is Maria Lucia Uribe. I am the Executive Director of Arigato International Geneva, and I have the privilege to moderate this dialogue today about the impact of war on children's rights and well-being. Allow me to start with a moment of silence for the many victims of war in the world, for the millions of children who have lost their lives in the midst of an armed conflict and violence, for those who have lost their parents, their families, their right to education, their right to survival and development, but also their sense of purpose and trust in humanity. Let us hold a moment of silence for those children that are currently stripped from a protective environment, who are living in fear and pain. May their dignity be uplifted and their bodies, minds, hearts, and spirits healed. The conversation today, titled "Is Our Conscience Revolted?" is part of the Culture of Encounter project at Georgetown University and is convened by the Collaborative on Global Children's Issues and an international interfaith working group on child rights. Our conversation today is grounded on rights and faith. It is a conscious listening exercise with participants who have experienced suffering, loss, pain, and disconnection as a result of war and violent conflict. It is not a debate, nor it is a discussion on who is right or wrong. It is a conversation, and I would say a difficult one, about what we hold most sacred: life and the innocence of children in the midst of war, and particularly in the midst of the current situation, Israel-Palestine. It is a conversation with those who, despite their life experiences and being part of deeply polarized societies afflicted by long-lasting conflicts, are and have been working for justice, peace, and living together. The sanctity of human life is at the heart of all religions and is also enshrined by international human rights instruments. The inherent dignity of the child is embedded in the Convention of the Rights of the Child, which is the most ratified human rights instrument in the world, and which recognizes children as subjects of rights. The belief that all human beings, including children, deserve to be respected and treated with dignity and protected from harm without any type of discrimination is a common principle, deeply affirmed and valued in all religions and spiritual traditions. Religious traditions and human rights instruments remind us of our ethical responsibility to care, protect, and uphold the dignity of each and every child. And yet, in the midst of war, those same ethical principles and obligations seem to be forgotten, trampled upon, diminished, and violated in unthinkable ways, and we have seen this for decades across the globe. In the current crisis in Israel and Gaza, children were deliberately attacked, killed, and taken hostage by Hamas. Thousands of children have been killed and injured in retaliatory strikes in Gaza and continue to die each day. Have we lost our humanity? Is our conscience revolted? In the words of Graça Machel, it is unforgivable that children are assaulted, violated, murdered, and yet our conscience is not revolted, nor our sense of dignity challenged. This represents a fundamental crisis of our civilization. The impact of armed conflict on children must be everyone's concern and is everyone's responsibility. Today, we have the privilege to engage with 5 participants, 4 of them from Israel and Palestine, and 1 from Rwanda. This intergenerational conversation will take us to reflect about the impact of war on children's rights and well-being, the impact on the present, but also on their future, and what role faith plays in children's protection, resilience, and trauma healing. Our participants are not speaking on behalf of any particular group or community. They are representing themselves by telling their stories and sharing their experiences and reflections. With us, Dr. Rima Salah, Palestinian, former Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, and currently serving as chair of the Early Childhood and Peace Consortium. Dr. Sarah Bernstein, Israeli Executive Director of the Rosin Center for Education and Dialogue in Jerusalem. Yara Rashi, a nonviolent resistance Palestinian activist and co-founder and board member of Iptikar Palestine for Social Innovation and Entrepreneurship. Odilia Mater, Israeli, co-founder of the Nagiv Media and recently working as program assistant for the Middle East policy at the Friends Committee on National Legislation in the US. And Ian Mansi, Rwandan, who has worked at the intersection of peace education, child protection, and vulnerability in Rwanda, and is program assistant for the Collaborative for Global Children's Issues at Georgetown University. I could say much more about our participants today. You will find more about their profiles and their experiences on the chat. I thank you for accepting to be part of this conversation, but also for your braveness to create the space to listen, to share, and to speak up in the midst of so much pain. I would like to start our dialogue by starting with a question about yourselves. And the question is, what values have shaped your lives, and how, in the current situation or adversity and violence you have experienced in your lives, those values have helped you to go through? And I would like maybe to start with Yara. Yara, would you like to go first?
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you for everybody who's here to speak and everybody who's here to listen. What values have shaped my life? I am someone who grew up in Bethlehem, in Italy. I come from two religions, Muslim and Christian, and I was educated in Christian schools and universities, and but I live in a Muslim community. I'm also a third-generation refugee. So my grandfather was kicked out of his village in 1948. And when you ask me about my values, I can only picture all of these lined in front of me, all of this history that I come from, and think of only freedom and the need for freedom and justice and equality, as we are lacking it from, we have been lacking it for 75 years here in Palestine. It is not easy to live a life lacking all these three very important pillars of life. I'm again mentioning freedom, justice, and safety. And this recent escalation, the recent aggression on Gaza, has only taught me how hard it is to live a life in such circumstances, and how unfair the world is, and how much we need to work on ourselves to prevent this from happening again, and actually to stop it from happening as it's happening right now, still at this very moment. There are children who are being killed. And yeah, this is the of my values. Thank you.
Yara, thank you. And I think freedom, equality, justice, and safety are values that I think everyone would agree with you. And I hear you when you say that those values have been difficult for many years for you and for your generations to live with and to uphold. So thank you for sharing this. I would like to maybe invite Odilia. Odilia, would you like to share?
Sure. So I was born and raised in Jerusalem by what I sometimes call a mixed family, because my mom was a Reform cantor. So she held progressive Jewish values, and my dad is very conservative in his values and considers himself modern Orthodox. But over time, I received much education on our own family's history, on the Jewish people's history, fleeing persecution, fleeing genocide, fleeing oppression, systemic and individual oppression. And throughout the years, when we learned the slogan, never again, to me, it was always a given that that was applied to every peoples everywhere. And unfortunately, I see it applied only to the Jewish people. Never again also stems from, I think, a more biblical psalm that we remember every single year on Passover. Ki ger hayita be'eretz Mitzrayim, you were once a slave in Egypt. So out of that position of once being oppressed and holding that part of your identity, you have to, as commanded by God, remember every single year that that is part of your history and identity. And for me growing up, I think with a lot of my mother's guidance, that was just to be applied as a humanistic, universal approach to every human being, not just our people. I think that very much influenced me. Some of the values, though, that I hold today are values that I had to teach myself. Some of the values that I grew up with were values that I had to unlearn. Values like supremacy, that I do not hold anymore today. I was educated to hold at some point in my life. But seeing the situation unfold now, I'm grateful that I had the capacity to unlearn those and see with a clear image how horrifying the situation is without giving it, putting it within a framework of justice or well-intentioned violence. And that's been driving me in the last few months.
Odilia, I think it's not easy to unlearn, and it's not easy to recognize that those values that we have been taught to uphold are values that are not maybe in line with justice or with peace or with the recognition and acceptance and respect for the other. So this seems very brave also for you to share. Thank you, Odilia. Rima, would you like to share?
Yes, thank you. Good morning and good afternoon. Yes, the war on children in Israel and Palestine not only revolted my conscience, but made me lose all hope in humanity. But if humanity is giving up, I am not giving up my lifelong commitment for the protection of children from all forms of violence and the realization of their rights, whoever they are and wherever they are. I have to continue in the pursuit of peace and justice. Growing up as a Palestinian refugee, I often asked my parents, what is a refugee? Why are we refugees? But I also witnessed their sacrifices to make life normal for my older sisters and I, ensuring that we get the best possible education, inculcating in us the values of courage, resilience, eagerness to learn, empathy, as well as the respect of all cultures and beliefs. In my life in a Palestinian refugee camp in Jordan, to conduct my research for my doctoral thesis, I witnessed the terrible effects that war and displacement have on people's life, in particular on women and children. I also witnessed the tremendous strength and hope of women and families. And the essence of their hope lay in their education, in the education of their children, in social justice and peace that will take them back to their cities and villages one day.
Mm.
It is this message of hope and resilience that I carried with me in my long journey with the United Nations and with UNICEF, where I worked in many different parts of the world, in Asia, in Africa. I worked in countries that were marked by wars and violent conflict. In those countries, families found themselves trapped in situations, in devastating situations, disrupting the fabric of their societies and compromising the very foundation of all their institutions. Equipped with international conventions and resolutions, the UNICEF's team and I worked hard to alleviate their suffering. Hence, my struggle for justice continues. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rima. And I am encouraged also to hear that as a child, for you as a child who grew up also as a refugee and your family as well as refugees, that you continue upholding those values that your family taught you, even in the midst of violence, displacement, and so much fear, I imagine. So thank you for sharing, Rima. Sarah, please.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this important conversation. As I grew up in the UK, in England, and I think that many of my fundamental values were formed there when I moved to Israel nearly 40 years ago, and have struggled to integrate those values with what I see around me happening in Israel and in Israel-Palestine. In my professional life, I think that the verses that influence me most strongly are verse from Psalm 85. Chesed ve'emet nifgashu, tzedek v'shalom nashaku. Mercy and truth are met together. Righteousness or justice and peace have kissed. And I think as we try to deal with the terrible, terrible events of October 7th and the terrible fear and trauma that everybody in Israel is suffering since then, and as we try to can't even, I find it difficult to even imagine, well, I don't have to, I mean, the terrible, terrible events that are ongoing in Gaza. I think that we have to try and hold on to these values. We have to try and hold on to mercy and truth. And I think that there is a huge challenge with both of them in these terrible times where everybody is living with such pain, such fear, such trauma, and terrible just catastrophe. And that I think now I understand this verse. Every time I come back to this verse, I understand it slightly differently. And now I think that we have to hang on to the mercy and the truth in order to create the justice and the peace. So we have to keep fighting for justice and peace, but in order to do that, we have to hang on to our compassion, to our mercy, and to truth as to what is in this terrible situation.
Thank you, Sarah. And I fully understand how difficult it is also to even articulate, in the midst of so much pain, how those values are carrying us and carrying you, also all of you, in this difficult situation. Thank you. Ian, you want to go next?
Sure. Thank you. I think for me, in terms of values, as a second generation post-genocide Rwandan, having grown up in a country that had experienced the inexplicable and the unimaginable, and being able to sort of come back from the ashes and be able to rebuild, I would say community has been a big value for me, being able to define that in different ways, being able to find new definitions to the word community and what that means and looks like for different people in different circumstances in the aftermath of the genocide, where many had lost family, many had lost their entire villages and communities. Being able to find a place to root yourself and say, this is my community, and being able to identify with that. And I think that also goes with identity. The idea that as much as it's difficult to preserve and protect anything in the midst of loss and in the midst of everything that happens with war and conflict and genocide, that identity is the one thing that people oftentimes can be able to hold on to say, I am this person. I may be removed from my home. I may have lost everything that ties me to this place. I carry it within me. I keep it within me wherever I am. And that's something that I grew up learning and hearing a lot, being told by family, parents, and community to say wherever you are, you carry this identity with you. And it doesn't matter. It's not tied to anything physical. And I would say, lastly, one of the values that has also been drilled into me and into a lot of young Rwandans is resilience. It's how do you come back? How do you keep living? One of the statements I grew up hearing a lot was that when you bury a seed, it does not die. It goes through momentary death because it's buried, but then from that comes life. From that comes a plant and something out of it. And so being able to say we can still be resilient in the face of insurmountable odds and be able to rebuild, be able to give birth to a new story, to a new journey and a new identity. So I'd say those are three of the values that have always kept me moving and pushing through everything and anything.
Thank you, Ian. Very powerful. That's part of carrying yourself and who you are, despite of the circumstances, pushing and trying to change you. And I think that's very powerful. And that connects to that resilience, how, you know, as a young adult, you have managed to keep that despite the challenges, the intergenerational trauma and so on. And I think often when we experience violence repeatedly, and particularly children, one important aspect in life that gets challenged is the moral core of people and our capacity maybe to empathize with others, to differentiate even from right from wrong. And we have seen evidence and research on this. And yet, despite living amidst violence and conflict, these values that you have mentioned remain strongholds for you. So I would like to explore a little bit more about this. And Rima, I would like to maybe start with you. We know the visible impacts of war on children, and you started to mention a little bit in the beginning. We know the impacts physically on children, we know the impact to the environment, but we also know that war impacts their social and emotional well-being. So from your experiences, Rima, what are the impacts of war on the mental health of children, particularly in the early years? I think this is something that not often is spoken about, and it would be good maybe to start our conversation with some reflections on this. Please, Rima.
Thank you very much, Maria Lucia. Yes, in 2022, approximately 468 million children were living in conflict zones. Also, at the end of 2022, more than 108 million people were forcibly displaced. So, an estimate 42.3 million were children. As we speak, a tragedy is unfolding in Gaza, Palestine, and more than 18,000 people have been killed, and more than 6,000 children were killed, and 1.9 people have been displaced. The executive director of UNICEF said, the Gaza Strip is again the most dangerous place in the world to be a child. End of quotation. In the Israel-Palestine war, children have been exposed to at least 4 of the 6 grave violations against children during armed conflict as identified by the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1612 and other subsequent resolutions, including killing and maiming, abduction of children, attacks on school, hospitals, and the impedance of humanitarian aid. What is also alarming and should concern us all is the negative impact of deprivation and violence, physical and structural, on young children and the generations to come, affecting our communities and our societies. Neuroscience evidence clearly demonstrates that toxic stress, malnutrition, and other deprivation in early childhood can result in adverse psychological functioning and interpersonal relation, including violent behavior, individual and across generation. But the good news is that neuroscience and other multiple disciplines such as epigenetics, psychology, education, economics indicate how early childhood development services can prompt members of high-risk groups to rebuild trust, to reconnect, and develop long-lasting resilience. The emerging science, therefore, heralds a new era for peace building through the investment of early childhood development of young children as a path to building peaceful and inclusive societies. In these critical times, unfortunately, there is insufficient investment in the early years of life as a path for social transformation and violence prevention. That is why we are convinced in the Early Childhood Consortium that early childhood services are very important everywhere, and particular in situation of war and conflict. And a message to you, let us together start erecting building blocks for peace, for a peaceful future for our children, just changing the tides of violence and building a peaceful world where children are the drivers for peace. Thank you.
Rima, you have highlighted several important aspects, and I'm glad that you are mentioning also the science behind the experiences of violence and war in children, because the impact is long life. The impact goes, as you mentioned, in psychological impact, social, emotional, the impairing capacity of children also to relate to one another, to build positive relationships with others. And I think these are things that we don't mention very often, and that it has an impact in the way societies are built, societies develop, and of course on what you are saying, on the development of peace, particularly in the current context of Israel-Palestine, that has what seems to be an intractable conflict for so many years. What does this mean for the new generations? What does it mean for the children who will have, when adults, take the pieces and build a society? So thank you for this, Rima. You talk also about the toxic stress, and you talk about social services and support. At the moment in Gaza, it's not possible to provide many of these services. So what can be done to support children, to support the mental health of children, and what mechanisms or practical ways can be created?
Yeah, thank you. That is why also I was saying that, because in the access in humanitarian response, in situation of war and conflict, we have humanitarian response. Therefore, in the humanitarian response, services for children should be included. Unfortunately, until now, they are not included. For example, psychological aid, for example, as first aid, psychosocial services are important, working with families and parents, because as you know, during war and conflict and what is happening also in Gaza, families cannot provide for their children. So empowerment and working with families, working with parents, working with caregivers is very important.
Thank you. Thank you, Rima. And I believe we will continue talking about these supporting systems that are very fragile in this particular context and how those can be strengthened, or what are the ways we can support those.
Mm-hmm.
We know
the most important thing is that the United Nations and all organizations should consider early childhood services as any humanitarian response. This is very important, and this is our message to United Nations and all other organizations.
Thank you, Rima. So we see that conflict and violence permeates societies, permeates relationships, ways of thinking, seeing the other and the world. Odilia, you have been working on the intersections of conflict, media, and education, in several areas in Israel. So how, from your experiences, the diverse narratives of conflict and polarization affect children's capacity to empathize with others? And maybe you can also tell us more, what role does media play in this context?
Thank you, Maria Lucia. And I think to start, I'll just say that within Israeli discourse, oftentimes we are told, or a slogan runs around saying that Palestinians grow up to hate Israelis or Jews. A lot of the focal point within Israeli media is about how Palestinians grow up within a system of hatred. And to me, it's so ironic to think that as a whole, we're educated to join a military and inflict a violent oppression on other people, and people aren't questioning linking between the two. It's supposedly a non-violent piece of our education and upbringing. So I can walk us through my personal trajectory as an Israeli child. Was growing up in an area bordering Palestinian East Jerusalem. My side of the neighborhood, my neighborhood, Armon HaNetziv, had people with full rights, voting rights to the country that controlled the elements of our life. And the people across the street from me were East Jerusalem Palestinians, or stateless people who don't have voting rights to the country that dictates much of the basic fundamentals of their lives and rights. I went through the Israeli education system. Within the Israeli education system, we have zero context of Palestinians, and if we do, it's in a discriminatory fashion. I will point out a really brilliant researcher, Nurit Peled Elchanan, who wrote a book called Palestine in Israeli School Books. And one of the biggest pieces that she discovered was that earlier in the state of Israel, there was some kind of education about Palestinians. It was often very stereotypical and discriminatory. And over time, there is basically ultimately no education about Palestinians whatsoever within the education system. So we grew up systemically ignorant of people living right beside us. Also, schools are separate from each other for the most part. After the education system, I personally partook in a pre-army gap year, which is an education system. It's funded by the Ministry of Security in Israel, Department of Security. There are educators, there are lecturers, we volunteer, we work with communities. I was in one that considered itself quite liberal. We never met a Palestinian in my year studying. In this pre-army gap year, we went to the West Bank, and the majority of the speakers we met were far right-wing speakers justifying the settlement expansion in the West Bank. After that, I joined the military, and I was a teacher sergeant. So I was teaching military propaganda. I taught a 60-hour course called Zionism, and that was a military perspective on the history of the Jewish people and why the Israeli state exists and wars with these people that are Arabs beside us. Again, being part of the education system, teaching soldiers how to think about the situation, it was, today I can say in retrospect, teaching ignorance very, very intentionally. And after the military, my focus was more so on media, because I met Palestinians in an education program called the Arava Institute for Environmental Studies, where we studied Palestinians, Jordanians, Israelis, and internationals together on environmental issues with a transboundary nature. And the first time I met Palestinians was at the age of 25, to have a heart-to-heart conversation and actually understand what their experience of this very place we were living in, including East Jerusalemites I'd never really met outside of working in a kitchen with as a waitress, and they were washing dishes. Like, I did not have those interactions growing up, even when we lived adjacent to each other. So fundamentally, most of the education that Israelis do receive about Palestinians comes from mainstream Israeli media. And mainstream Israeli media does no justice to Palestinian narratives. There's barely any representation of Palestinians themselves speaking on their own behalf. And the specific issue that I was touching was the recognition of unrecognized Bedouin villages in the Negev Nakab region for the last 3.5 years. It was extremely hard to bring forward pieces with such debilitating human rights violations outside of a context of this is a security measure, this is how things are. So I think that the media is a huge source of information when people are eager to understand what's happening. If you open Ynet, which is the leading Israeli media platform today, and read their articles in English, you will see an extremely, I would say, militarized media that is the main source of information, I think, for most Israelis today. And as children who grow up throughout this whole process, it is really, really hard to break and disrupt that cycle of learning that either Palestinians do not exist, and if they exist, they're only a security threat. They're nothing else.
And Odilia, let me build on that, because I think you have built many important points here. I mean, the upbringing, the society, the education system, the textbooks, the biases, there's a whole system that doesn't allow you to think beyond and to encounter the other. You said, I didn't know how to interact with a Palestinian. And so what changed, or what helped you change to be able to approach for the first time a Palestinian? You mentioned the environmental camp you joined, but many people could go through that, and yet they can remain in their own island. So what was that point, or what was that kind of helped you think differently?
First and foremost, I think I will thank Palestinians who took the time of day to sit me down and explain to me what oppression they're going through. I think it's a draining process a lot of Palestinians have gone through in their life, and I've had the pleasure of meeting people, extremely loving, caring, and humanistic people. One of them is in Gaza right now, who just shared what their life looks like to an Israeli who really had no idea. I'll also say that there are several human rights organizations and educational organizations, like the one that Sarah works in, the Rossing Center. I worked in the Forum for Regional Thinking and the Arava Institute for Environmental Studies, who are trying to disrupt the trajectory that leads to ignorance. So these organizations have put us together in a room, and I've been able to learn and try and hold the capacity to kind of break cycles that I was in originally. I'll also say that I was very privileged to travel in my life and go to other countries and have fluent English because my parents are American. So I tried really hard to expose myself to international media. And when traveling, I just met people who knew more about the place I was living than I had. And to be totally honest, I just was embarrassed. I was like, who is this really cool Irish woman describing to me what is happening in the West Bank that's 25 minutes away from where I grew up? And I don't have anything to tell her because I'm that ignorant. So I think traveling really had me face my blind spots and then actively seeking information to fill those gaps, and meeting Palestinians who had the courage and energy to walk me through what it is that they're going through.
Thank you, Odilia. I take this word that you mentioned, disrupting a trajectory. I think that's a very, how do we disrupt this trajectory? I want to invite now Yara and Sarah. From what you have heard, Yara and Sarah, from both Rima and Odilia, what are your reflections on this from your own experiences? And you are both seated now in Israel and Palestine. So what does this tell you, these reflections, and in very briefly also, how you see from your perspective on that part of the wall? Yara, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I'm not surprised by what has been mentioned earlier. I just have a few points that has been running in my head listening to all of that. I would like to point out the privilege of being able to learn from a textbook. While I, myself, a Palestinian child, and I'm an average Palestinian child who was introduced to the Israelis, who actually in my own house, as our house was invaded several times, I was introduced to the Israelis as soldiers who had to take my father as a human shield. So this is what I saw with my own eyes. My father was taken as a human shield to attack, to actually arrest the neighbor. And I was like 6 years old when this happened, and this was the how I was introduced to Israelis. In our books, we do learn what's happening on the other side, and we know how the Israeli system is not allowing people to learn. We very much know their system. We know that everything is based on the military, everything is based on what they hear from the news, and whatever is outside of that is not true. And a lot of people, as Odilia mentioned, grew up to that. Very few people could see the light, while we Palestinians have been experiencing the lack of their knowledge. We had to fight for our lives because of the lack of their knowledge. Ian a while ago was talking about the aftermath of genocide. And I was thinking about myself being a Palestinian child who never had the chance to talk about the or to think of the aftermath of the genocide, because my parents have survived, or my grandparents have survived the genocide in 1948. And then another genocide occurred in 1967, and it's ongoing. It has been ongoing until today. So when we are talking about Palestinian children, when I, as a third generation refugee, when I have to think, I don't know if we ever had such thing as an aftermath for a genocide. We simply don't do that. We didn't get the chance to do that, as we have been going through an ongoing Nakba. And for those who do not know what a Nakba is, it's a Palestinian word that means catastrophe. It's an ongoing catastrophe until today that we have been experiencing. And to pair that with what Odilia was talking about, it's because of the lack of education on the other side. We had to suffer all that. Yeah.
Yara, thank you for also sharing. And I believe, of course, we know you both sit in different walls in a way, even growing up so close. So what you share and what you experience, of course, with violence and so on, is a way of experiencing the war. And I want to believe also that for Odilia, for example, even if she didn't go through the violence and the war herself, the pain and the suffering stays also, because it's the pain of the other. And I think, as Odilia has also shared, the realization that our system, that the way I have grown up, in a way has contributed to that. That has a heavy impact, I think, on oneself when we realize we have been part also of this. So I think realizing from both sides is a critical aspect. So thank you for sharing, Yara. Sarah?
I could talk about this for, for much longer than we have. I think there are many aspects to this. I think that so taking one of Audelia's examples, I insisted that my children take part in an encounter program during their high school years, because I could see that the effect of growing up in this education system, which does culminate in army service, and where you never meet your Palestinian peers, or there are some schools that have some sort of encounter, but I wanted them to have something substantial, something ongoing, something where they could really get to know Palestinians their own age and understand something about the reality in which we live. I think that, again, I talked about truth and the struggle to hang on to the truth in this terrible time. Obviously, Israelis see the events of 1948 very differently from the way that Palestinians experienced those same events. But, none of us have the truth. None of us have access to the truth. And therefore, the best that we can do is to hear different narratives and understand events from different points of view. I think that, to focus in on this moment and the impact of this moment in time on what going forward, the trauma on both sides is so extreme that when I think about, the children who were kidnapped and all except, I believe, 2 have been released. The 2 Hamas claim that they're dead. There was no official confirmation of that. These kidnapped children and all other children in Israel who they haven't experienced being kidnapped, but they have followed those events day by day, minute by minute, update by update. You can't walk down the street in Israel without being surrounded by posters with the photos of everybody. From a news point of view, Audelia talked about the importance of the media, and it's even more extreme now with the Israeli media only portraying things from this Israeli point of view. But also on the Palestinian side, a survey released today shows that something conducted by a Palestinian research organization shows that over 80% of Palestinians do not believe that the atrocities of October 7th actually took place. So when we're fed from such radically different, when there's so much fake news on both sides, it's almost impossible to see how we overcome that. And children, Ian mentioned resilience. I think one of the things we have to do now is to try and strengthen children's resilience, but it's so the obstacles are so huge now and so overwhelming as to how we manage to do that. And if I think about, obviously there are thousands of children who've been killed in Gaza. There are tens of thousands who have been displaced, if not more. I can't do the maths immediately as to how many displaced. I suppose there must be hundreds of thousands of displaced children in Gaza. There are tens of thousands of displaced children in Israel, evacuated both from the north and the south. The task is mammoth.
Yes, Sarah, and you have mentioned several important aspects. I think, you know, this balance, right? On the one side, what it's happening also in Israel is a collective trauma also, and the hostages still not being released, and the continuous reminder of this. And I think building on what Odilia has said, you know, in the education system, reminding us that the Palestinians do not want Israeli to exist, and so on and so forth. So that is a constant reminder in the lives of children, with images, with society, with media, and so on. I want to go now back to Yara, and then we will continue talking about this, Sarah, because you have been working on education and so on. But I want to go back to Yara, because Yara has been working on nonviolent resistance, and for many years, Yara. And when you think of all this and what is, you know, is being bred in the minds and hearts of children, how do you get to do nonviolent resistance? How do you get to stand up for peace when you have been also bred in a way hatred or you know, fear and pain? So maybe you can share, Yara, a little bit more on this.
Yes, thank you, Maria Lucia. I'm one of those who believed also in never again, but it was not in the context that has been mentioned before, but rather never again of what I have personally been through. So I took it upon myself to protect every Palestinian child from going through what I have been through as a child, through the Second Intifada, through the everyday assault that we go through as Palestinians in 75 years. I'd like here to mention that there are also Palestinian children kidnapped and sexually assaulted in Israeli prisons until this very moment. And in the hostage deal that happened a couple of weeks ago, most of who have been released were children under the age of 18. And most of them have said that they have been sexually assaulted in Israeli jails. But do we hear that in the media? No. Do we talk about their mental state? No. And speaking of the fake news, all of this genocide that started on the 7th of October started because of a lie that 40 babies were beheaded, and they could not prove it. And then they said it did not happen. So this whole thing of fake news is the thing that we have to fight. It's very hard to live with it. And now going back to your question, yes, I have been working in nonviolent resistance, and I was 100%. I believed 100% that nonviolence is the way to get out of violence, and I wish to continue believing this. Although throughout the years we have been doing nonviolent resistance, and the Israelis have been facing us with the resistance, and we say, okay, maybe this technique did not work, so we try another technique of nonviolent resistance. We worked with women, we worked with children. I had to convince children who have seen the failure of peace for several years. They have seen it with their own eyes, that no, it can actually still work if you put enough faith in it, if you put enough hard work. And they have been doing that. And now I find myself in a very embarrassing situation, having to go back to these children and telling them, after seeing what they have seen since October 7th, that peace still works. How would I even do that? Honestly, since the beginning of this genocide, It's been more than 2 months of this ongoing genocide, and I find myself lost. I'm going to be very frank here. I have lost my compass. I don't know what values do I stand to anymore. I do not know if we Palestinians will be able to survive with all of that violence, with all of this fake news that is being propaganda. Like, it's the propaganda of the Israelis is all over the news of the Western media, everywhere. And we Palestinians, we had to show our children being killed on TV for the people to believe us that this is happening. I don't know if we can go on with non-violence among all this violence. And I
Yara?
just, as a final remark, I would like to say that we started this whole non-violent thing because in the second Intifada, we Palestinians have used violence to fight the Israeli violence, and we have lost a lot. We went at least 50 years back in Palestine. And this is where I started believing in non-violence.
Yara, thank you, and we feel your pain, and I want to acknowledge also that. And this reminds me of a workshop we held in Colombia. I'm originally from Colombia. We were talking about empathy, and then someone said, "How can I tell the father or the mother of a child that has been raped several times by a guerrilla member that she or he needs to empathize with that person who has done that to the child?" And I think for both, for Israeli and for Palestinians, that's the difficult question. How can you empathize? And we are seeing this selective empathy, right? And in our discussion there in Colombia, this was maybe 15 years ago, someone said, it's trying to see the humanity of the other. And yet that is a very difficult step to make, right? And so I want to think a little bit more about this, Yara, and because you have been committed to peace. Now, of course, this is difficult, but there is something that guides us when we're working for peace. And a lot of this has to do with faith and the spirituality that we carry.
Yes.
Is this something that resonates with you? Is your faith helping you in any way in this moment?
Definitely, without any doubt. I will give you an example of what's happening. Again, going back to the kidnapped children. There has been a letter written by the mother of one of the kidnapped children in Gaza, who said that my daughter felt like a princess in Gaza. And if you can look it up, and you would find it very easily. And this gives you a hint of what we Palestinians, what kind of values we have. I think we are very faithful. We all our lives learn to turn the other cheek, as Jesus told us. And we have been practicing that. We have been like giving the other cheek for so long. And this is actually the basis of what I have been doing for years. When I read Holy Script, I can touch the piece, and I can actually see it with my own eyes here in Bethlehem, the city of Christ. It's in every stone you would see peace, and this is something that has been carrying us all these years. This is something that has been helping us to do our work, even if at some point we feel like our faith is in peace, of course, is a bit fading away, and then suddenly we find something that would bring us very fast to that faith. Yeah, and I must repeat that we as Palestinians, we as faithful culture, and I say culture because I'm not talking about a specific religion. I'm talking about the whole Palestinian community.
Mm.
We never ever gave up on humanity. We even in the toughest situations, we would still deal with humanity. And I'm not talking about something that is fictional. It's actually, it has been proven. It has been pictured for several years.
Thank you, Yara. And I want to move in this part of the role of faith. And I want to talk, Sarah, bring to you, because you have been for many, many years working on peace building through interfaith education. And I don't know what role interfaith education plays at this current moment in Israel, Palestine. And I would like you to maybe build a little bit on this, on your work, and what does this mean in the current context?
So, unfortunately, all of our religions, Judaism, the religions that we practice here in the Holy Land, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, the Druze religion, all see themselves as religions of peace and all preach peace. But we don't seem to be very good at putting that into practice. Unfortunately, the violence is such and has been such over the years that violence begets more violence and makes it harder and harder for people to see the possibilities of peace, of non-violence. I implore Yara to continue in the path of non-violence, because I really do deeply believe that violence only begets more violence. Some of the information you have shared is not information that I am indeed I'm not familiar with, and I will look into. It's, you know, I'm not sure this is the best moment for interfaith education, or indeed for interfaith dialogue. It's very, very difficult for people to talk to each other right now. As we know, and social psychologists tell us, that when people are experiencing this level of fear and this level of trauma, the ability to empathize with the other side is almost zero. And that's what we're seeing at the moment here. And if there isn't an ability to empathize, if there isn't an ability to listen to the other side with empathy, then there isn't really value in dialogue, you know, at the present moment. So I run a joint Jewish-Palestinian staff. The organization, we work together to try and build inclusive societies here in the Holy Land. And obviously, we have to speak to each other. We have to work together, because that's what we do. But we first of all took time separately, to process separately, and still now on an ongoing. We never used to have regular meetings where the Jewish staff would meet and the Palestinian staff would meet. But now that has become part of our ongoing work, is that we have to take the time to step back and be within our own communities, both in terms of sharing our pain and sharing, you know, struggling to make sense of what's happening, but also in terms of, okay, so what are the needs now of these two different communities? Because the needs of the Jewish community within Israel and the needs of the Palestinian community within Israel, that's most of our work takes place within Israel itself. The needs of the different communities are very different. Our experiences of this situation are very different, and therefore we have to adapt our work to meet the current needs. Some of those are in parallel. So, for example, Rima spoke of, the importance of supporting children at this time, and social services and the lack of, ability to support all children at this time, and all children here are now traumatized. So what we try and do is work with teachers, because they can't, there aren't enough social workers to have contact with all the children in the country, but all children go to school. So if we work with teachers and give teachers the tools to help children express their pain, express their fear, process it, if we work with the teachers, then we can reach, and I'm not just talking about the Rossing Centre, many other shared society organizations and other psychosocial support organizations are working with teachers, but we are particularly working with Palestinian teachers who have less access to such services.
Thank you, Sarah. And I understand the difficulty of this encounter with the other. Several of you have been mentioning encounter with the other and how difficult it is now. But you mentioned something important about religion. Religion is often a source of peace, should be a source of peace and support in these difficult times. But we often see that religion can also be used as a weapon of war, can be used to divide. And I understand in our previous conversations that you are also seeing some of this in Israel, Palestine. What are your reflections on this? What role can religious communities can play in upholding our child-centered conscience, in upholding those values that we have mentioned before? And I would like to have this open question to all of you, for whoever wants to start, maybe Rima and Odilia, on the particular role that faith communities have, but also understanding that religious communities can also play a negative role in the current context. Rima, would you like to start? Rima, you're on mute.
Thank you very much, Sarah, Yara, all of you, Odilia, for talking about faith and how important, and Yara said, faith holds us. And yes, as I grew up as a refugee, I saw my mother wearing black for many years, and I asked her, why are you wearing black? Because her brother was killed in 1943 in King David Hotel, when they put the bomb in the King David Hotel. Other 14 members of my family also were killed. So I grew up with 8 orphans in the house. We grew up all together because they didn't have a father and mother. But yes, our faith holds us. As I said in the beginning, yes, we are revolted, but we have to overcome, and faith is very important. Yes, religious leaders have an important role. Religious leaders, religious communities are very important. I just want to remind you that a meeting in 2015 took place in the United Nations, where religious communities, religious leaders attended from all over the world. And on this occasion, the UN High Representative for the Alliance of Civilizations, at that time, His Excellency Nasser Abdelaziz, told them, your words today at the universal body, the UN General Assembly, about tolerance and reconciliation will be heard by thousands of people around the world. Indeed, you are messengers of peace. Your voices are respected with your respective communities. That's why we count on you carrying back home a message of peace, reconciliation, and forgiveness. Indeed, we have to forge partnership with religious leaders, with religious communities, with religious organizations, as they have the powerful and moral asset and influence to make them as prime advocates for peace and social cohesion. Religious communities have temples, they have churches, they have mosques in every village, in every town, in every city of this world. spanning this remarkable panoply of institution is a network of communication and action. So they have to communicate, they have to and they have to preach peace instead of preaching war. This is very important. Religious leaders also, as I mentioned before, can help, should play an important part in supporting families, parents to provide the nurturing care for their children. In, in time of war also, for example, they have to acknowledge the right to every child to a spirituality. We know, we talked about spirituality, how important it is. Hence, spiritual development is not optional, but it's a component of development that is lies at the core of the well-being of children. Spirituality lies at the core of the well-being of children, contributing to their holistic development. And in the case of war, to really influence what is happening now. Listen to them. Of course, sometimes they can be negative, but listen to them when they are really very positive. Thank you.
Thank you, Rima. And I think, as you mentioned, religious communities are positive allies in this, but we often see that it's maybe some religious leaders or religion and scriptures are used against of the other. Odilia, some reflections on this?
Yes, sure. I think that part of my position, seeing how Judaism evolved in Israel, I get the sense that my religion has been hijacked for political means. It's very cynical to use specific texts, to use specific values from this religion that is vast and very, very diverse to justify actions that I could never, ever stand beside. And then moving to Washington, D.C. 3 months ago, I realized that there are other ways of expressing Judaism. I don't think that it's a coincidence that some of the first voices calling for a ceasefire in Gaza are Jewish voices. I think that a lot of people are seeing images and information coming out of Gaza that is extremely triggering to our upbringing and how we've seen our families' histories play out. I also work at an organization today that is specific Christian denomination. It's the Quaker denomination. It's called the Friends Committee on National Legislation. And the first week after the war began, we led a letter with 26 church denominations calling for a ceasefire, and another letter with over 80 national interfaith organizations calling for a ceasefire. I think in places of conflict, in places of indoctrination, in places of violence, it is very hard to see solidarity between folks holding humanistic values. And I've had to take many, many steps away to evaluate how I can share solidarity between religions. I also have to say that this feeling of this religion being hijacked has even hurt my own capacity to feel empathy for my own people. And being so many steps away and feeling that solidarity from Muslim brothers and sisters and Christian brothers and sisters towards the pain that I'm going through, suffering losses on October 7th. I've been able to breathe into that because the foundation of their solidarity with me is not denying other people rights, the right to live, basic human rights and livelihood. And so having those steps back and seeing solidarity and how it functions in the United States, I'm seeing this in other countries with rising anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and anti-Arab hate worldwide. One of the first and most incredible reactions is interfaith solidarity. And so if there is a way to channel that and apply it back home, that will give me a lot of faith and hope. And I will echo what Sarah said, which is how disheartening the truth of the matter is how hard it is to have these conversations today. Even hearing Yara reading about your background and how much you've voiced nonviolent resistance like in your own personal history, and how disheartening it is to see the process you're going through is painful. I think the most effective tool for everyone's security is hope. And I think that hope, what I'm finding is that it lies very much in faith communities right now, at least in the United States that I've seen.
Odilia, thank you. These are very powerful words, because I think that is what religions should do, is to help us keep that sense of hope, is to help us keep that sense of humanity, is to see the humanity in the other. Is at the core of all our religions. And yet we are disheartening when this doesn't happen, as you see. And I'm glad that you have found, through the work that you're doing in the US, that reminder that religion and your faith is still a part of holding you and holding your compassion for the other, a part of the actions of maybe some religious people that take religion and use it against the other. So thank you for this, Odilia. I'm conscious of...
Can I just add one word about interfaith
Yes.
initiatives that are going on here at this time? Because there have been some brave religious leaders who have stood up for solidarity. There have been this week during the Jewish festival of Hanukkah, there have been interfaith events taking place. So it's, you know, it's a struggle, but you know, I don't want to say that it's not happening at all. It is happening, but it's a minority, and it tends to be happening at the more liberal end of the religious spectrum.
Thank you, Sarah, for that reminder. I'm conscious of time, and we have 15 minutes left. And we have been talking about these impacts on children, the current situation, education, media, religious communities. And I want to move our conversation to the future. And we have been touching about this, what this means for the future of children. And Ian is here with us, and Ian has been quiet and very attentively during the last hour. But Ian, I would like you to share with us about intergenerational trauma, both from your experience, but the work that you have also done, and maybe lifting up some of the things you have heard here, Ian, in this conversation. And then I want the four of you to maybe reflect on that and your final comments on this aspect of intergenerational trauma, but also on resilience of children and what it means to build maybe a more peaceful society. So Ian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maria Lucia. It's been very meaningful to me as well to be able to listen and experience this conversation and this discussion from this end. And as you spoke, and as the different panelists were speaking as well, we kept talking about the encounter with the other and what that looks like. And maybe I'll start off by saying, after the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, one of the biggest things that needed to be addressed in Rwanda, there was need for truth, there was need for healing, and need for reconciliation. And part of the reason why that was so important and vital was that as a country, there was really not much of another choice. You know, we still had to coexist. We still had to live within the same space. There's really no other solution to the problem. We had to find a way for life to come back into the land of 1,000 hills. And that took a lot of learning how to unlearn from people. But I think one thing that I can bring out here is that one of the moments in my life when I realized that trauma has a long-lasting effect on generations was when, I think it was 2016 or 17, very recent, when we were working with a group of young high schoolers, and we were doing a community service project. And this was done in the framework of dialogue and talking about resilience and how to rebuild a country and what that means. And as we were doing this community service project, we were rebuilding the home of a genocide survivor and helping her build her home that was falling apart. And the community around her neighborhood came in to help us. And these young high schoolers, energetic, ready to support somebody that they understood the need for in her life, are working with the community. And we finished building this house. And at the end, as we are having a bit of a community discussion about the need for these activities and why young people need to be involved in the future of the country, one of the members of the community stands up and tells us he was among the young people who took part in the genocide. He was one of the young people who actively sought out Tutsis and killed them in his community. And he told us, I was as young as these kids who are here today. And so seeing them doing something that is so different and opposite to anything that I was taught and learned and grew up in, to me is something powerful. And it was very moving to hear him say, I was very different from who you are when I was at your age. But one of the things that really lit up in my mind was the realization in that moment that for a split second, these 15, 14-year-olds struggled with seeing the humanity in this man who openly said he had killed people. For a split second, they weren't seeing him as the community member who was helping them in their activity. They weren't seeing him necessarily as a story he was telling. Suddenly, for a split second, he wasn't human anymore. He's the other who took part in the genocide, who killed people. And in that moment, I realized it was for the first time that they'd encountered who this other person was. And so having to learn how to see that person as human again to that encounter is something that I've come to realize doesn't stop with the end of genocide, with the end of conflict, with the end of war. It's an effort that needs to go on for years. And as a generation that was born right after the genocide and that to experience a lot of the rawness of being right after the genocide, and I realized that as children, you experience this in different layers. You experience this at the national level, and Rwanda as a country made it a point to say, we have to live together, we have to coexist. If we don't see the other as a human, we are only going to devolve into worse nightmares than this. So we have to move forward. And so at a national level, you have that show of strength that says people have to coexist. But the reality is, when you come down into communities, what does that reflect into? We hear the message, we know it, we understand it, we know we have to be one, but our communities, the wounds are still raw. People do have to coexist because they don't have much of a choice, but how are they living together? In those cases, coexistence turns into tolerance sometimes. And you're gonna live there, I'll live here. It's difficult for me to see you. How does that then translate into the family level, into the media, when you're experiencing narratives from different people? You hear one thing in the public, but you hear something different behind closed doors when your parents are having to relieve the trauma of what they experienced. So as children, these different layers and complexities leave a mark on you. And so as you grow up, and as we grew up, part of what we had to learn was, how do you redefine a new identity? How do you find yourself and decide what your life and your future is going to look like in the midst of all of this? And everybody agreed we needed to move forward. Everybody agreed we needed to heal and reconcile, but it takes time. And it takes a lot of effort and intentionality. And there's a lot of pain on that road. So as children, the effect lasts longer than people realize. And so I think that's why it's very important for us to talk about this and realize that children who are currently alive, who are born in these days, but also children who will be born in years to come, will still experience waves and impacts of this in ways that people sometimes do not fathom.
Thank you, Ian. And this is very, very powerful, listening from you also, as you have experienced, and in our discussions, you talk about exactly what you were saying. You were told to reconcile, to live with the other, but in closed doors, you were told the opposite. And that trauma lived and relived again through your interactions with your family, with the people around you. And I think that's basically what we will see in the future for children who have been traumatized, who have been victims of violence, and the generations to come. But what do we do about it? And I want to maybe hear from we have only 5 minutes left, so I will give you 1 minute for your closing remarks, in a way reflecting on what Ian has said, and maybe also a call, an ask, or your final thoughts. So I would like to start with Yara.
Yes, thank you. Hearing Ian's experience is really, really inspiring, the least to say. I don't know how I managed to see the positive thing of it, but at least they got to the point where they could think of what happened. And for me, I just would like to say that Palestinians, Christians, Muslims, and Jews have lived in Palestine peacefully at some point in time. And hopefully we will get back to doing that sooner or later, hopefully sooner. I would like to say that this whole thing that you have been listening to is not an audition for anybody's empathy. It's a call to apply everybody's humanity, and we should start now. Now is the time to do something. Every minute that passes by with this genocide continuing is time wasted, is a gap widening between the violent today and the peaceful future. So let's start now.
Thank you, Yara. Thank you. Sarah?
Thank you, Ian. That was, I also, like Yara, I found it, despite the difficulty of what you shared, I found it truly inspiring and a source of hope. I think that, you know, we have to live, we are in the same situation. We have to live together. We have to live side by side. And now is the time to begin that properly. Now is the time to finish this war, to ceasefire, return hostages, make a deal, and move forward. And this has to move us to a place of negotiations, peace, justice, security for everybody. Because you know, we have to have that in order that we can even start the process that Ian talks about. Because until people have that safety, until they have that security, it will be almost impossible. So that is I think all of our call, that we need a ceasefire, and we need to change the way we are dealing with this situation.
Thank you, Sarah. Rima? Rima, you're on mute.
The scar of the on Palestinian children and Israeli children. Let this scar not go to the generations to come. Let's work together and let's support our children. As Yara said, we all live together, Christian, Jews, and Muslims. My sisters went to school with a Muslim on the right and a Jewish girl on the left. Let's do it again, and let's support our future generation. Let's support our children. Let's empower them today that they can interrupt the cycles of deprivation, but build also a strong foundation for peace, resilience, social justice, and social cohesion. Let's listen to each other. Let's listen to each other and live together in peace and justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Rima, for calling for justice. Odilia, please.
Thank you, everyone, for the words that you've said. I'm really honored actually to be on this panel with such amazing speakers. I will take advantage of this platform and, like the lobbyist that I am, encourage everyone, like Sarah said, we need to call for a ceasefire today. Before that happens, before bombs aren't stopping to drop on Gaza and on Israelis, we can't move forward. So you can go to ceasefiretoday.com. If you're from the UK or Canada, there are actions that are applicable in other countries as well. Call your congressperson, schedule a visit, go to the district offices and lobby for a ceasefire. In meetings with Congress members and their staffers, we're seeing that there's an avalanche of support for a ceasefire. Recent polling in the United States shows a majority of Americans believe in a ceasefire today, including from the Republican Party. So I think that Congress people need that message over and over and over again. I think that we need to also call to not send military support right now to Israel. Do not fund weapons used to carry out these atrocities. Several offices are saying that they don't support the escalations of how the Israeli military is fighting in Gaza, but they're still signing on a supplemental of $14 billion in Israeli military aid. And I think that that needs to be addressed. Taking off the lobbyist hat, I want to encourage people to understand their own capacity to feel empathy for more than one people at the same time. If you were horrified by what happened on October 7th, you're allowed and you should be horrified by what's happening in Gaza now and vice versa. If there's a message of humanity, it's that this has to end for everyone's well-being and safety and prosperity in the region. And I really thank Ian for talking and sharing a voice of a person whose family was so deeply affected by such horrifying events. And you are a voice of reason and beauty. And I hope that we can reach a point of aftermath and have a very simple conversation about the environment or music or art, and not have to deal with these horrifying events and let children be children. So thank you for the platform, and thank you to the rest of the speakers who shared such important insight.
Thank you, Delia. Let me finish with a quote attributed to Nelson Mandela. No one is born hating another person because of the color of his or her skin, or his or her background, or his or her religion. People must learn to hate, and if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes naturally to the human heart than its opposite. And I want to close with this, and I want to call upon our moral compass and reclaim our humanity, as you have very nicely said. Through your experiences, people like you are a hope for the current situation in the midst of violence and conflict. Your actions are not drops in the ocean, but inspiration for others, are examples of resilience, and you're helping with the work that you are doing to build bridges of trust, build bridges and challenge narratives. I hope that for those who are listening today, who were listening today, this courageous conversation can also sow seeds of hope in you, and that for all of you participants, and Sarah, Rima, Odilia, Yara, and Ian, for bringing your wisdom, that this space of listening, of sharing, can also be transformational in one way or another for you. So I thank you for the vulnerability, for calling for the difficult and speaking up the difficult words, but also calling for justice, for peace, for listening to one another, and for hope. So thank you so much for this time. Thank you.